If topics and videos like this interest you, then please subscribe and hit that like button. Make sure you also click the bell to be notified when we release a new video. They say necessity is the mother of invention. Well, if that is the case, then necessity is the mother of all the newest weapons in the Iranian military. Iran has been under a number of different sanctions and arms embargoes that started back in the 1980s after the Islamic Revolution caused the overthrow of the Shah and installed a conservative Shia Muslim theocratic government in Iran. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iran was able to utilize their large numbers of Western weapons to fight the Iraqi forces. This includes using such weapons as the F-14 Tomcat and the only firings of the AIM-54 Phoenix missile in combat. During this time, the first of the arms embargoes and sanctions came about. This began to limit the Iranian military. Most of their weapons were older US and British tanks, armored vehicles, and aircraft. After 1991, the Iranians began to have the beginnings of their own weapons industry and started to produce copies of primarily Russian tanks and armored vehicles to bolster the numbers and to get away from the much antiquated equipment they had. This included around 1,000 T-72S models, built in the country but not under license. It also included some T-55s that were converted into a sort of T-72 by adding the turret and gun of a T-72 to a T-55 chassis. These kind of modifications and creations are usually something that is seen in armies that are either desperate or have spare weapons that they wish to employ but don't have the actual piece of equipment they were supposed to be hooked to. You see these kinds of modifications especially in armies of rebel units by a large margin. Everything from pickup trucks with mounted machine guns or aircraft rocket pods, or in some cases rocket artillery pieces mounted in the truck bed. In other cases, larger weapons like recoilless rifles, anti-aircraft guns with various shapes and sizes of other pieces of artillery that would be too cumbersome to transport on foot. In Syria and Libya, for example, you have seen many of the warring factions use these so-called technical trucks to fight against the standing army and their professional equipment. You saw many of these modifications done as far back as World War II with the Germans. However, Iran takes this to an entirely different level. Take the Zulfikar tank, for example. This tank started out as an M48 patent chassis mated to the 125mm turret of a T-72 for the Zulfikar 1. Through two versions comes the Zulfikar 3, which bears a striking similarity in appearance to the American M1 Abrams. Then there is the Karrar tank. It is no coincidence that specialists regard the Karrar as some kind of a copy of the Russian-made T-90MS, the most advanced modification of the T-90 platform. According to retired Major General Vladimir Bogatyrev, chair of the board of the Russian National Association of Retired Military Officers, he said, "It is based on the T-72 platform, but it also has something from the American Abrams and M60 tanks. Some elements are borrowed from the M48 and the British Chieftain tank. They took all these elements and tried to design their own tank." But nothing takes this notion of necessity being the mother of invention and imitation being the sincerest form of flattery more than with their Air Force. The Iranian Air Force is in serious need of new aircraft. The vast majority of their Air Force are old F-4 Phantoms, F-5 Tigers, and F-14s. If you are enjoying this video and want to learn more about the history of the Iranian Air Force, then consider getting IRIAF 2010, The Modern Iranian Air Force in paperback by Tom Cooper, Liam F. Devlin, and Babak Tagvi. If you have a history or military buff in your friends or family, this book would make a great gift. Link in the description. All these aging warbirds were built in the 1970s and the 1980s at the latest, with the F-14s being retired from the US and all of their scrapped aircraft destroyed to keep parts from falling into Iranian hands. This has led to problems keeping these aircraft airworthy and flying. The Iranian solution was to create their own fighter aircraft to replace the dwindling numbers of their old legacy aircraft as parts became harder and harder to come by. Enter the HESA Sege, the HESA Khowsar, and the HESA Azaraksh. Recreating a tank off the design and parts of older ones is one thing. Making a new aircraft of the design of an older one is quite another. The Sege was the most ambitious of these aircraft. The first public versions of the Sege were painted blue and gold and given a twin tail similar to that of a Navy F-18 Hornet in the colors of the famous Navy Blue Angels. All of these aircraft have one main thing in common. They are all modifications of the old F-5 Tiger, with new avionics and some different engines, but essentially with the same flight characteristics of the aircraft they look like. While the F-5 Tiger was a very nimble and able fighter and strike aircraft in its day, it was first originally built in the 1950s, and aircraft today are much more capable and more lethal than the F-5. The F-5 would have a difficult time dealing with most of the fourth generation aircraft still in use and in production around the world, including the F-15 and the F-16 that are in use by many of Iran's neighbors. This is nothing compared to the newer fifth generation aircraft like the F-22. The F-22 has already shown its supremacy over the Iranian Air Force. These aircraft represented essentially the best the Iranian aerospace industry could produce. They do show a country wanting to be respected as a world power by showing their ability to make their own combat aircraft, a specialization only a select few nations have capability to even perform. It also shows their need to be seen as innovators. When the Sage was shown to the public, an Iranian general was even quoted as saying that the Sage was like the F-18 but better. However, when looked at by the outside observer with some knowledge of aircraft design and performance, it is almost a comical attempt at saving face and looking more powerful than they really are. And while the aircraft are indeed a bit comical, it is surprising that a country that can produce some very advanced rockets and artillery systems all on their own cannot come up with a more modern and more unique aircraft to showcase what they truly are capable of. However, these attempts at making their own aircraft have indications that these are merely stopgap measures to the time when the embargoes and sanctions are lifted. Iran has been looking at numerous and more modern aircraft from Russia and China to buy to replace their antiquated air force. Will the Iranians actually keep with trying to make their own air force, or will they simply go with the tried and true method of buying the best they can afford from abroad? Time will tell. Wait, don't go to your next video yet. Check out the description for our social media links. We now have our own Twitch channel, subreddit, along with being found on Facebook, Twitter, and Parler. Comment below and we will see you on our next video.